Imagine an ordinary bank located in a small town. Customers come and go, transactions take place, everything seems absolutely normal. But there's one disturbing detail. The money circulating inside isn't issued by the government. These are notes created by the bank itself, paper money with its own design, exclusive stamps, and values determined internally. And the most astonishing part? People accepted it. Merchants took it. Families saved it. The local economy revolved around those bills that technically shouldn't even exist. It sounds like fiction, but it happened. And we're not talking about some distant country or forgotten era. We're talking about the United States, the 19th century, a time when private banks had the power to print their own money and directly competed with the federal government for the trust of ordinary citizens. This story involves unrestrained ambition, devastating financial crises, and a question that still echoes today. Who should have the power to create money? The state? The market? Or anyone capable of convincing people that a piece of paper has value? Stay until the end, because what you'll discover about the American banking system will completely change your understanding of money, power, and trust. It was 1836. President Andrew Jackson had just destroyed the second bank of the United States, the institution that functioned as a primitive central bank. Jackson deeply distrusted centralized banking. To him, it represented a concentration of power, political manipulation, and privileges for elites. His decision was radical: abolish the central bank and leave the financial system entirely free. The result was unprecedented in modern financial history. With no central authority, no effective regulation, and no control over currency issuance, a new era emerged, what historians now call the free banking era, or more bluntly, the age of monetary chaos.
State banks, private banks, community banks all began printing their own notes. Each institution designed its currency, chose its colors, determined its denominations, and crucially, promised that those papers could be exchanged for gold or silver, as long as you trusted that specific bank. Imagine the scene. A merchant in New York might receive dozens of different types of bills in a single day. One from the Bank of Michigan, another from the Agricultural Bank of Pennsylvania, and yet another from the Mercantile Bank of Ohio. Each one looked different, each had a different reputation, and each was worth a different percentage of its face value. An entire parallel industry emerged: banknote detectors, printed guides that listed hundreds of banks and indicated whether their notes were trustworthy, doubtful, or outright fake. Merchants had to consult these manuals before accepting payment. It was as if every transaction required a mini financial audit. Some banks were solid. They held sufficient gold reserves, honored commitments, and built their reputations over time. Others were pure opportunists. They sprang up in remote areas, deliberately isolated, to make it difficult for clients to redeem their notes for precious metal. These were called wildcat banks, named after the wildcat-inhabited regions where they operated. The scheme worked like this: open a bank in an inaccessible area, print as many notes as possible, lend the money at high interest, and when creditors started demanding gold back, disappear. Close shop, move to another town, start again under a new name. Between 1830 and 1860, it's estimated that over 1,600 banks issued their own notes in the United States, and more than 7,000 different types of banknotes circulated. As for fraudulent banks, the exact number is impossible to know. Economic historians estimate that between 30
Ordinary people were trapped between the need to use money and the inability to know which money was real. Farmers were paid in notes that turned out to be worthless weeks later. Workers saved earnings that vanished overnight when their issuing bank collapsed. Entire families lost everything. And the most disturbing part? In most cases, it wasn't even considered a crime, just market risk. The situation reached its breaking point in 1857. A financial crisis began in Ohio and spread like wildfire. Banks collapsed one after another. Panic gripped the streets. People rushed to exchange their notes for gold before it was too late, but vaults were empty. Promises could not be kept. The free banking system, meant to bring liberty and healthy competition, had created systemic instability instead. The absence of regulation didn't produce efficiency, it bred predators. Competition among banks didn't improve services, it encouraged fraud. And monetary freedom didn't strengthen the economy, it destroyed trust. Merchants began refusing certain notes. Entire towns reverted to bartering because no one trusted paper money anymore. The American economy, in the midst of territorial and industrial expansion, was being suffocated by its own currency. That's when an inevitable question arose. What if the government took control? What if only one institution could issue money? What if there were rules, oversight, and real consequences for fraud? The American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, forced this transformation. The federal government urgently needed funding and realized it couldn't rely on a chaotic, decentralized banking system. In 1863, Congress passed the National Banking Act, the law that created a unified national currency and established federal regulation over banks. For the first time, banks needed a federal charter to operate. They had to maintain minimum reserves, undergo audits, and, crucially, lost. Only the federal government could create money. The resistance was fierce. State banks called it tyranny. They claimed it destroyed economic freedom and dangerously centralized power. But the public, exhausted by fraud and instability, supported the change. Decades of misplaced trust in private banks had drained the nation's patience. In the years that followed, the system stabilized. In 1913, with the creation of the Federal Reserve, the United States finally established a modern central bank, precisely what Andrew Jackson had destroyed 77 years earlier. Yet the legacy of the free banking era endured. It left behind a deep distrust of financial institutions. It fostered skepticism toward banking promises, and it fueled ongoing debates about who should control money. Curiously, some modern economists look back at that period with nostalgia. They argue that free banking, despite its flaws, fostered innovation, that competition, though chaotic, prevented state monopolies, and that citizens had more options, even risky ones. These are controversial views, but they reveal a timeless tension: freedom versus security, market versus state, private competition versus centralized control. So, what does this story teach us? That money isn't just paper, it's materialized trust. It's a social contract, invisible yet powerful, where everyone agrees that something has value, as long as we believe others believe the same. The 19th century banks learned this the hard way. They could print as many notes as they wanted, but if no one trusted them, they were just decorated paper. And trust cannot be printed. It's built over time through consistency, transparency, and accountability. The US government learned that absolute freedom in finance doesn't bring prosperity, it brings predators. That the absence of regulation doesn't strengthen markets, it opens doors to fraud. And that money as a public good cannot be left entirely in private hands. But we also learned the opposite. Excessive control can be just as dangerous. Governments, when they fully dominate currency issuance, can print irresponsibly to fund wars, cover deficits, or manipulate politics, simply by creating more paper. It's a delicate balance, and perhaps never a perfect one. Today, we still hear echoes of that story. Cryptocurrencies are, in essence, a modern attempt to revive the idea of private, decentralized money. Bitcoin, Ethereum, and thousands of others, each with its own rules, implicit issuers, and promises of value. And once again, we face the same dilemma: freedom versus security, innovation versus stability, distributed trust versus centralized trust. The story of America's free banking era doesn't give us definitive answers, but it offers something even more valuable, a warning. A reminder that economic systems are, at their core, systems of trust, and that destroying that trust, whether through private greed or state irresponsibility, has devastating consequences that span generations. So I ask you, have we really learned this lesson? Do we understand that money is a collective responsibility, not an individual opportunity? Are we building stronger financial systems or just repeating the same mistakes with newer technology? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story made you think, subscribe to Enriching World, where we explore the past not to memorize dates, but to understand the present and prevent history's mistakes from repeating. See you in the next journey through the history no one ever told you.